He struck her so quickly that most people in the mess hall didn't register the motion, just the sharp recoil of her head and the stunned silence that rolled around the room like a dropped tray. The echo of his hand meeting her cheek didn't need to be loud to feel violent. It was the kind of sound that made a room freeze because everyone knew something sacred had just been violated. She didn't fall, that almost made it worse. She steadied herself with one hand on the edge of the table, breathing through the kind of pain that demanded dignity even when dignity was denied. The fluorescent lights above cast a pale sheen on her uniform, catching the trembling rise of her shoulders as she pulled herself upright again. Her cheek reddened in seconds, blooming with the unmistakable mark of humiliation, but her eyes stayed fixed on the ground, refusing to let a single tear betray her. He laughed, a lazy, dismissive, almost bored laugh that scraped at the nerves of everyone who heard it. The kind of laugh a bully uses when he's convinced no one, not the room, not the world, will ever hold him accountable. He leaned back in his chair, arms folded across his chest, shoulders loose with the arrogance of someone who thought a rank patch made him invincible. His voice carried with a smug sharpness as he muttered something meant to belittle her further, but the words hardly mattered. The room had already understood the cruelty underneath them. Around them, forks hovered in midair, sandwiches stopped halfway to open mouths, boots stilled against the tile. Conversation died so abruptly that the humming of the refrigerator units behind the serving line suddenly felt loud. Every Marine in the room saw him, saw her, saw the line that had been crossed so clearly it may as well have been painted across the floor. She didn't meet anyone's eyes, not his, not the silent bystanders. Only the worn tiles in front of her, the ones she had walked across day after day without thinking, suddenly felt unfamiliar, like she was standing somewhere unsafe, exposed, outnumbered by something she couldn't yet name. Her pulse drummed in her ears, each beat echoing the truth she didn't want to acknowledge. She had been struck in front of a room full of people, and now the world felt too quiet. But the quiet was not empty. It was filling slowly, steadily, with something else. A chair creaked. A boot scraped the floor. Someone inhaled sharply, a breath drawn not in fear but disbelief. The air shifted almost imperceptibly, the way it shifts just before a storm breaks. It wasn't anger yet, not fully, but it was the unmistakable beginning of it, the silent, simmering outrage of those who had seen enough. From the corner of her eye, she noticed movement. One Marine stood up. He didn't say a word. He simply rose, spine straight, gaze fixed on the man who had struck her. A second Marine followed, then a third. No one barked orders. No one exchanged glances. The silence itself seemed to summon them. The man who had laughed took a moment to realize the shift. At first, he didn't care. Then he noticed how the room was no longer simply watching. It was aligning. It was assembling itself into a judgment he hadn't expected and absolutely did not want. His smirk faltered, just barely, but enough for the room to notice. She still hadn't lifted her head. She felt the tightening in the air, but didn't dare interpret it as protection. She had been disappointed before, believing people would step in only to learn. They'd step back instead. But something was different this time. The silence did not feel like abandonment. It felt like anticipation. Like the room was holding its breath, waiting for her to reclaim something that had been taken. Her fingers curled slightly on the table's edge, steadying herself not from the pain of the strike, but from the weight of 100 unspoken questions pressing down on her. Why now? Why her? Why in front of everyone? But before she could find an answer, every Marine in the mess hall pushed back their chairs and rose to their feet. They didn't rise with aggression or theatrics. They rose with the unmistakable steadiness of people who knew exactly what moral lines were worth defending. 100 different stories, backgrounds, tempers, and loyalties, but every one of them carried the same unspoken conviction. This was not going to pass. The man who had hit her finally straightened in his seat, his posture shifting with the first flicker of unease. His arrogance didn't vanish, it calcified, hardening into defiance. He tightened his jaw, as if daring anyone to contradict what he'd done. But even he couldn't ignore the wall of silent bodies forming around him, not touching, not threatening, simply surrounding him with the one thing he couldn't dismiss: accountability. She finally lifted her head. Her eyes were still wet, though not with tears she'd let fall. The redness on her cheek pulsed visibly with each heartbeat, a reminder of the moment that had cracked something inside her. She scanned the room, expecting condemnation or pity, but she found neither. Instead, she found stillness, an entire mess hall standing as if waiting for her voice, her decision, her truth. The realization shook her more than the slap had. For years she had carried the belief that standing up for herself would make her a target, that speaking out would isolate her, that surviving quietly was the safest option. But now, in this suspended moment, the quiet was no longer hers to bear alone. One Marine, a staff sergeant built like a wall, stepped forward. His expression wasn't furious, it was deeply disappointed, the kind of disappointment that cut deeper than anger. Another Marine, younger, eyes wide but resolute, shifted to her side almost instinctively, as if positioning himself to shield without smothering her. Not one of them touched her, but their presence created a barrier between her and the man who thought he could bruise her without consequence. The man exhaled sharply, clinging to the last scraps of his bravado. "What?" he muttered under his breath, disbelieving this sudden rebellion of silence. "You all think you're gonna—" But he stopped, not because anyone interrupted him, but because he realized something impossible to ignore. She wasn't afraid of him anymore. Not with this many people standing. Not with dozens of eyes no longer darting away, but fixing squarely on the truth he'd tried to hide with his laughter. The mess hall felt heavy, not hostile, but morally charged, like the weight of collective judgment was pressing down on the tiled floor. The air smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant, normal scents made strange by the intensity of the moment. Someone shifted their weight, boots scraping softly. A tray clattered down at an abandoned table where a Marine had stood so quickly he forgot to set it gently. She swallowed, the burn of humiliation giving way to something steadier. Her voice trembled when she finally spoke, not from weakness but from the gravity of being heard. "You don't get to do that," she said softly. The man blinked, surprised by the calmness of her tone. She didn't yell, she didn't shake. She spoke with the raw honesty of someone who had endured enough and was finally drawing a line. No one applauded, no one cheered. The silence remained, but it shifted again, deeper now, like the room was absorbing her words and preparing to answer them. She stepped back from the table, freeing herself from the posture of someone who had been cornered. She straightened her uniform, smoothing the wrinkles where his hand had shoved the fabric out of place. Each movement was deliberate, reclaiming control in the smallest and most powerful ways. She became, slowly, visibly not the woman who had been struck, but the woman who refused to bend. And the Marines saw it. The staff sergeant glanced at the man, jaw tightening. One could almost see the memory flicker behind his eyes. Every lecture about honor, every oath, every unspoken code they lived by. It wasn't about rank. It was about respect he had violated in front of all of them. The man who had hit her looked around and finally understood the truth. No one here was going to shield him. No one was going to pretend they hadn't seen what they saw. His authority had evaporated, replaced by a spotlight he had no idea how to stand under. The younger Marine beside her spoke not loudly, but firmly enough that the words carried. "You crossed a line." And for the first time since the slap echoed through the room, the man didn't laugh. He tried to retreat into indifference, but indifference had abandoned him. Without laughter to shield him, his face revealed something far smaller than fury. Panic. Panic that came not from fear of punishment, but from the sudden realization that the room he'd always assumed he controlled no longer recognized him as anything but a man who had gone too far. The Marines closest to him didn't step forward with force. but with purpose. Their movements were slow, deliberate, measured, like a tide rising around a lone rock that didn't yet understand it was moments away from being swallowed. Each step they took wasn't for her alone, it was for everything they believed the uniform stood for. And he felt it. He felt the room rearranging itself, not against him, but in favor of the truth. She watched all this with a strange, unfamiliar clarity. Moments earlier she had been trembling. Now she felt steady, anchored by something she couldn't name. Her cheek still burned, but the burn had become a reminder rather than a wound, a reminder that she had survived the moment meant to break her. Around her the air carried the warmth of solidarity, the kind that didn't need to speak to be understood. A lieutenant stepped forward, older, steadier than the rest. His voice was quiet, but the kind of quiet that cut through a room because it carried conviction rather than volume. He didn't address the man directly. He addressed the truth hanging between them all. This ends now. The man swallowed hard, his gaze flicking between the lieutenant and the crowd closing in on every side. But when his eyes landed on her, he found something he had never seen from her before. Strength unhidden. Strength he hadn't expected. Strength that refused to bend under him. She didn't look away this time. He opened his mouth as if to defend himself, but no words came, not because he didn't have any, but because every attempt to justify himself wilted under the weight of 100 eyes. His excuses, so easily deployed in private, couldn't survive the daylight of this moment, not here. Not with her standing unbroken in front of him. The mess hall remained unnervingly calm. No shouting. No threats, no chaos, just the steady, suffocating awareness that the entire room had turned into a witness. And witnesses, he knew, were dangerous things. Someone near the back shifted just one step, but that single movement sent a ripple through the crowd, a reminder that even those furthest from the confrontation were ready to stand with her. If needed, it was the kind of unity he'd never inspired and never could. Her breath steadied. She took one small step forward, not toward him, but toward herself, toward the version of herself that refused to shrink anymore. She had spent too long carrying silence like armor, convincing herself it was protection when it was really a cage. But the cage had cracked the moment the room rose for her. "You don't get to define my worth," she said, voice firm but still quiet. "Not today." The words didn't have sharp edges. They didn't need them. They were the truth spoken without apology, clean, simple, undeniable. And the room absorbed them like an oath. He stepped back, bumping into a table behind him. The metal rattled, a stark contrast to the suffocating stillness, and for the first time he seemed aware of how trapped he had become, not by the Marines, but by the consequences of his own choices. His shoulders sagged, his eyes dropped, his arrogance dissolved. The lieutenant looked at him for a long moment, then turned to her. There was no pity in his expression, only respect, deep and unmistakable, respect for the resilience she had shown. Respect for the quiet courage that had turned an entire room into her shield without her asking for it. Behind her, a Marine gently moved a chair aside, clearing space as if symbolically removing any obstacles she had been forced to navigate. Small gestures, powerful meaning. The man's voice finally emerged, barely audible. "I didn't." But even he seemed to hear how hollow the beginning of his excuse sounded, and the rest of the sentence never surfaced. Not because anyone stopped him, but because the truth did. The silence around him felt like judgment. The silence around her felt like honor. The moment stretched, fragile and tense, as if the entire room were holding a collective breath. She didn't rush to fill it. She didn't soften the weight of what had happened or offer him an escape from the consequences he had carved with his own hand. Instead, she stood in the center of the mess hall, no longer the woman struck, but the woman who stood back up and let the truth settle where it needed to. A captain entered from the far doorway, drawn by the unnatural stillness of a place normally alive with chatter. His eyes scanned the room, catching the posture of the Marines, the rigid stillness of the man who had hit her, and the quiet strength in the way she held herself. He didn't demand explanations. He didn't raise his voice. He saw everything without a word. He approached slowly, each step echoing with restrained authority. The Marines subtly parted, their formation shifting just enough to show respect, without breaking the unity they had built around her. The captain's gaze lingered on the redness blooming across her cheek, the silent evidence of the violation that had sparked this storm. Her heartbeat thudded heavily, fearing the moment might turn into another dismissal of her pain, another instance where consequences were too easily forgotten. But as the captain stopped beside her, something shifted. He lowered his voice not out of secrecy, but out of respect for the magnitude of the moment. "No one under my command," he said, "gets to be harmed and stand alone." The words landed in her chest like a lifeline she hadn't allowed herself to expect. They were simple, but they held the weight of leadership that did not look away, did not excuse, did not ignore. He turned to the man who had struck her. The anger in his eyes wasn't explosive. It was measured, controlled, rooted in disappointment so deep it cut sharper than rage. The kind of disappointment reserved for those who had stained the very fabric they claimed to represent. "You shamed yourself," the captain said. "Not her, yourself." The man tried to stand straighter, clinging to what little authority he believed he still had. But authority meant nothing when character was gone. The Marines around him watched, silent, unreadable, but their presence made one thing unmistakably clear. He was on his own now. The captain looked to two NCO at the front. They understood without instruction. They stepped forward, not aggressively, but with unwavering purpose. The man didn't resist. His defiance was gone, drained out of him like the last trickle of water leaving a cracked vessel. He let them guide him toward the exit, swallowed by the same silence he had created. The door didn't slam behind him. It closed quietly, almost gently, as if the room refused to let him take any more violence with him. Only when he was gone did the collective tension begin to ease, shoulders lowered, hands unclenched. The air seemed to expand again, filling the mess hall with something warmer, steadier, cleaner. Marines who had stood unmoving for so long finally drew deeper breaths, their unity still strong, but no longer rigid with urgency. She remained rooted to the floor, not because she was afraid to move, but because she was overwhelmed by the enormity of what had just unfolded. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel invisible. She didn't feel dismissed. She felt seen, fully, undeniably seen. A Marine approached her, quietly placing a cold bottle of water on the table beside her. Another gently passed her a small pack of ice wrapped in a napkin. No one asked questions. No one pushed for details. They simply offered the kind of support that didn't demand anything in return. She pressed the ice against her cheek, flinching at the sting, but the sting felt different now. Less like a reminder of pain, more like a step toward healing. The captain stood beside her again. "You showed strength," he said, "but you don't have to carry this alone." For the first time since the slap, she allowed herself a slow breath that didn't hurt. Her voice was steady when she spoke. "I know," she said, and she did, because the room around her had proven it. Because the silence that had once been a threat had transformed into a shield. Because every Marine who stood had told her, without words, that the line drawn today would not be crossed again. She straightened her uniform, not out of habit, but out of pride reclaimed. The sting in her cheek would fade. The humiliation would not define her. What would remain, what would become the memory she carried forward, was the moment an entire room rose for her when she stood alone. And in that quiet, powerful unity, she understood something she had spent years doubting. Strength is not always loud. Sometimes it stands in silence, and sometimes that silence stands with you.